We've come to our last topic in 7th grade, which is the Civil War. It is a war that pits brother against brother and tests our nation's democratic standing. Sit back and relax as you listen to this video and do your questions, because it's going to be quite long. After the Southern states had seceded from the Union, the first battle of the Civil War will occur at Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861. Fort Sumter was a Union fort located in Charleston Harbor, which is in South Carolina. The Confederates fought this battle because they wanted to kick the Union out of the South, but Lincoln still believed that the fort in Fort Sumter had belonged to the Union because he did not believe that a state had the right to secede or leave the United States. After fighting, the Union will lose this battle. When it became obvious that the Union had severely underestimated the Confederate Army, they decided to develop some new strategies. The Union had the advantage of resources, unlike the South. They had more fighting power because there was a larger population located in the North, and soldiers could be easily replenished after they died. They had more food available to their soldiers. They had factories that did not exist in the South that could make war goods and uniforms, as well as having more railroad tracks that could easily ship supplies from one area to another fast. They also had an advantage that their president was a very good leader. Lincoln and his military officials would come up with an effective military strategy to help beat the Confederacy. This was developed in a three-part plan and aimed to beat the South. The first part of the plan was that the Navy would blockade southern ports to prevent trade. This would make it very difficult for the soldiers in the South to receive reinforcements or supplies. The second part of the plan was that Union riverboats and armies would move down the Mississippi River, capture it, and effectively split the Confederacy in half. States like Texas would be completely cut off from the East Coast, and it would be impossible for them to get any sort of supplies. The third part of the plan was to capture the Confederate capital in Richmond, Virginia. This was called the Anaconda Plan by Northern newspapers because it was like they were trying to strangle the life out of the South. While the Union had an advantage in having a great president like Abraham Lincoln, the Confederacy also had its own advantages. Firstly, they had strong military officials and they were very motivated in protecting their homeland. One of the biggest generals of the Confederate Army was Robert E. Lee, who was actually offered the position to be the head of the Union Army, but he turned it down to head the Confederate Army and secede with his state of Virginia. Their biggest disadvantage, however, was that they had a weak central government, and many states refused to cooperate with the Confederate government because they were afraid that their rights would be stepped on, just like they were during their time with the United States. The first official battle of the Civil War, not counting Fort Sumter, was the Battle of Manassas, or Bull Run. This occurred on July 21, 1861. During this battle, 30,000 Union soldiers who were very inexperienced met up with an inexperienced Confederate army. The Union soldiers had severely underestimated the Confederate army during this battle, and the fighting will go back and forth until the Confederacy receives reinforcements and holds strong under the leadership of Stonewall Jackson. This is now the second battle that the Union had lost during the Civil War. There will be a great number of casualties in this war due to a big change in warfare. For the first time, you have new technology being used, and this is referred to as the first modern war that the United States has ever fought in. Some of the new technology that was developed was ironclad ships. These would be wooden ships that had iron on the outside of them, and the advantage to having these new ships was the fact that they could damage wooden ships, and they could withstand cannon fire, and they resist burning. There were two ships in particular that fought during the Civil War. One was the Monitor for the Union, and one was the Merrimac for the South. As the Civil War was the first modern war that the United States has ever fought in, new weapons would be developed to fight this war. The first one being the rifle and the minie ball. The rifle fired with more accuracy due to the shape of the minie ball, and it was easier and quicker to load, unlike the muskets previously used in other wars. It could also fire more rounds, as the musket was only able to fire one shot at a time. The Minié-ball was also more destructive due to its shape and speed. This is also one of the first times you're going to see more modern grenades and landmines being used. On your screen you will see an example of the Minié-ball on the left versus the musket ball on the right. The cone shape of the Minié-ball made the weapon far more accurate, and it was able to cut through the air at a much faster speed. This led to ultimately more people dying in the Civil War due to gunshot wounds, as it was easier to hit your target than in the past. Here's a picture of what a grenade used to look like back during the Civil War. Note the flags on the back of the grenade. This made it easy for the grenade to sail through the air. As the war progressed, it was clear that the Union was going to have more problems than they had originally anticipated. The Union's biggest issue in completing the Anaconda Plan and getting the Confederacy to surrender was their head general, George McClellan. The reason for this was because he was far too cautious in battle and didn't want to take chances. He refused to make moves until he had more soldiers, and he also complained that there was no safe way to retreat his army across the Potomac River into Washington, D.C. after a few battles. McClellan was given a chance to prove himself at the next battle in Antietam, Maryland. McClellan's army would fight against Robert E. Lee's army on September 7, 1862, at the Battle of Antietam. This is known as the bloodiest single-day battle in American history, where 26,000 people either died or were injured. Instead of pursuing the Confederate army, who was in retreat, McClellan chose to do nothing because he felt he did not have the resources to pursue the army. Because of this, Lincoln would fire McClellan on November 7, 1862. He was a very ineffective leader and one of the biggest reasons why the Union was having a lack of success. So Lincoln did what he thought was right by getting rid of him. Lincoln's view on slavery came into play during the Civil War due to a number of factors. The biggest one was the fact that the Confederacy was looking to secure an alliance with England because of their dependency on Southern cotton. In order to keep England out of the war, Lincoln had to look at the role of slavery in the Confederacy. Lincoln himself was not sure if he had the power to abolish slavery where it already existed. Republican Party leader Horace Greeley asked Lincoln to change the focus of the war to slavery. The primary goal in doing this was to preserve the Union and keep Great Britain out of the war, as Great Britain was greatly against slavery at this time. They would not support a nation who continued to support slavery like the Confederacy if Lincoln turned the focus of the war to getting rid of slavery. To secure the fact that England would not enter the war on the Confederate side, Lincoln will pass the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863. This would only free slaves in states that are in a state of rebellion, meaning only the Confederate states. It would not apply to border states or the states that had slaves that stayed with the Union when the Civil War started, and it would also not apply to Confederate states that the Union had already taken control over. This was unsuccessful because it actually made more people join the Confederate Army, and it did not free a single slave in the Confederate States. It also allowed slavery to exist in the border states, which was still part of the United States. Again, one of the major reasons this happened was to change the focus of the Civil War to slavery. Throughout American history, during war times, the president's power is often expanded. Lincoln will suspend the right of habeas corpus during the Civil War. Habeas corpus is a court order that requires authorities or police to bring a person held in jail to a court to determine why the person is being jailed, meaning you'll know exactly what the charges are against you and be able to have a trial to see if you are guilty or not. During the Civil War, when Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, people were being put in jail without having any idea as to why they were there. The reason he did this was to limit the amount of spies that were coming in and out of the Union with top secret information. He also got rid of telegraph wires to federal offices. He did not want any messages to be intercepted by Confederate spies. This shows that Lincoln was dedicated to winning the war by any means necessary, even if it meant taking away citizens of America's rights. When the initial excitement of fighting in the Civil War and defending their nation had died out, Lincoln was in the need for more soldiers. Widespread desertion or leaving the army due to losses and casualties led to Lincoln needing to make conscription or the draft. A draft would force certain members of the population to serve in the army. The South had done this in 1862, and Lincoln will pass the Draft Act in 1863. This is the first time that it is mandatory to serve in the federal military service. It included all male citizens as well as immigrants who had declared their intention of becoming citizens between the ages of 20 and 45. Rich people were able to pay the government to not be drafted, so this resulted in many poor people having to go to war against their will. This also caused riots in many of the cities. African Americans were also able to join the Union Army as soldiers. In 1862, Congress passed a law allowing African Americans to serve in the military. Many were very eager to sign up due to the Emancipation Proclamation. By the end of the war, 10% of the military in the Union was African American. They did serve in their own regiments and often were segregated or separated from the white men in the other regiments. Because of discrimination, many African Americans will not rise above the rank of captain, and they will never be generals during this war. Just because they're in the North does not mean they're not facing racism. In 1863, you will see a decline in the effectiveness of the Confederate Army in many places. This is due to a number of shortages. The Confederate Army had a food shortage due to three things. Number one, a lot of manpower was used in the war and they did not have enough food to go around. Many slaves were deserting plantations and a lot of food was not being farmed that was once in the past. And also the Union soldiers were occupying or had taken over the food growing areas in the South. Because of this, meat becomes a luxury, so it was not available easily for people to eat. Also, corn and rice became short in supply, and this was important because it was very easy to transport. Now that they don't have this, they have to go looking for food elsewhere. Also, the price of food is going to go up because, like we stated in the past, the North had more food available than the South. They also do not have the railroad to transport food from place to place. Because of this, a lot of the armies will go scavenging for food around the areas. Because of these shortages, you will see Southern armies going north in order to intercept supplies. In search of supplies, Robert E. Lee will march his army north towards Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where you will have the biggest battle of the Civil War. This is also the biggest battle that will be fought in the North or in the Union. General Lee and his tired army engaged the Union Army in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania for 3 days. This is considered a turning point in the Union, since the Union will now win most of the battles afterwards. The Battle of Gettysburg is known as the bloodiest 3-day battle in American history. More than 30% of all soldiers at this battle will die. So for the Union, it's roughly 23,000 casualties, and for the Confederacy, 28,000 casualties. The Confederacy will never recover from this battle. It is a major loss for them, and it boosts the morale of the Union. While the Battle of Gettysburg was raging on in Pennsylvania, Ulysses S. Grant was looking to secure the Mississippi River in the west. Grant will destroy all the rail lines and supply lines into Vicksburg, Mississippi, and capture the city after a short siege. Because of this victory, Lincoln will promote Ulysses S. Grant to head general of the Union Army later on during the war. Because of the terrible aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg, Lincoln was asked to give a speech in November of 1863 in a ceremony to dedicate a cemetery on a portion of the battlefield in Gettysburg. Lincoln spoke for only 2 minutes, but discussed the devotion of each person who died on the field that day, whether they were from the North or the South, in their fight to preserve the Union and put the country back together. This will become one of the most important speeches and famous speeches given by Abraham Lincoln before his death. After the tremendous loss at the Battle of Gettysburg, Confederate morale, or reason to fight, is in sharp decline. The economy of the South started failing due to a lack of slavery, as well as people working the land in general. Soldiers will start leaving their regiments to save what money they had left and start working on their farms again. This will give the Confederacy a big disadvantage because they will not have enough people to keep fighting the war. They also no longer feel that there's a reason to fight the war, so many people are not willing to actually fight at all. Another reason the South is falling apart toward the end of the Civil War is because of a man that fought for the Union Army called William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman had his army in Atlanta, Georgia in September 2nd of 1864 when the Confederacy tries to cut off his supply lines. Instead of worrying about this, he decides to abandon those lines in favor of trying to fight the Confederates without them knowing what was happening. His people will live off the land instead of relying on rail lines for food, ammunition, and other supplies. By mid-November, Sherman sets off for the East Coast to meet up with Ulysses S. Grant to try to capture Richmond, and he burns most of Atlanta as well as the South on his path upwards. Because of this, the South will need major rebuilding after the Civil War is over, as he's literally burning everything to the ground. It was clear in 1865 that the war was coming to an end very soon, as the Union Army was approaching the Confederate capital of Richmond from both the North and the South, now that Tecumseh Sherman was coming up from Atlanta. After a Union victory at the city of Petersburg, Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, and his government will flee and burn it to the ground to prevent Union takeover. When it was clear that Robert E. Lee no longer had the support of his Confederate government, he will surrender to Ulysses S. Grant on April 9, 1865 at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. This will become the end of the Civil War. At Appomattox Courthouse, an agreement will be reached between the two generals, and the terms are very generous for the Confederate Army. As the Confederate soldiers were not captured and arrested, they were allowed to return home with their possessions. The Civil War did not just change how war was fought, but it also changed our government politically. No state will ever secede from the United States ever again from this point forward. The nation's government, or the federal government, assumed supreme national authority, meaning they were the ones who were in charge, not the states. The federal government's power will also be expanded, and for the first time ever, you will have the income tax to help the U.S. pay off their war debt, as well as the draft, which is continuously used today. We have not used it since the Vietnam War, but it does still exist, and men that are citizens must sign up for the draft when they turn 18. The Civil War remains one of the costliest wars in American history. Approximately 360,000 Union soldiers and 260,000 Confederate soldiers will die. This is roughly half the total amount of soldiers that have died in any American fought war in history. 275,000 Union soldiers and 225,000 Confederates will be injured during this war. The combined war budget between the Confederacy and the Union was $3.3 billion. After 20 years, the U.S. was still paying off this debt, but interest payments on debts plus veterans' pensions, so payments to soldiers after the war, were 2/3 of our federal budget. So 2/3 of the money that the United States was making was still paying off the costs of the Civil War. The Civil War did not just change our nation politically, it changed the lives of Americans all over. The Emancipation Proclamation only freed slaves in the states of rebellion, meaning that the border states such as Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware were able to keep their slaves. In order to entirely free the slaves, a constitutional amendment needed to be introduced. The Republicans will propose the 13th Amendment, and it will be passed in January of 1865. The 13th Amendment stated that slavery would be abolished except if it is used as a punishment for a crime. Many people will rejoice in the passing of this act. However, it is going to cause many problems with the South, who is very upset over losing their way of life. This also will cause much discrimination for African Americans during the period of Reconstruction, which we will cover next year. After the Civil War, there would still be a great deal of bitterness and animosity between the North and the South. On April 14, 1865, Abraham Lincoln and his wife attended a play, Our American Cousin, at Ford's Theater just outside the Capitol. While viewing the play, a man named John Wilkes Booth, a Southern sympathizer, snuck into the president's box and shot the president in the head with a pistol from behind. Booth then leapt from the box onto the stage and broke his ankle. He will spend the next 12 days on the run, and eventually will get caught in a barn and gets shot and dies. Lincoln will die the day after his shooting in a home across the street from the theater. With the death of Abraham Lincoln, America would lose one of its most beloved presidents and important symbols of freedom. Because of his death, the South's future and Reconstruction would be a disaster, as Lincoln's Vice President Andrew Johnson would prove ineffective and Congress would do nothing to help support the newly freed African Americans and the proper rebuilding of the South. The effects of this would be felt for many years to come.